Hey everybody, me and Greg, we did our article from Robert Barr and John Tagg, from Teaching to Learning a New Paradigm for Undergraduate Education. And we just wanted to break down the article for you guys and talk about some of the highlights and points that we thought were important so that you can understand the article and understand the information that they were trying to convey in the article. Basically, what this article talked about was that there was a change in the purpose, or there is a changing in the purpose of college, going from providing instruction to producing learning. Basically, what the authors talked about was that in the instruction paradigm, the main purpose of college is strictly instruction, conveying the knowledge from point A to point B to the students. Whereas the learning paradigm is more about the main purpose of college is to produce learning, not only to convey knowledge from point A to point B, but to create new points of intersection and knowledge production at point B, or the learning in the students. Basically, what the authors talked about was that the instruction paradigm mistakes a means for an end. Instruction or a lecture is just one area or one method of pedagogy that you can use to create learning or to spur learning in students. However, the learning paradigm says that there are multiple ways in which you can shape learning or facilitate that learning in students. It doesn't just have to be transmission from point A to point B. You kind of mold and shape the environment in ways that will be conducive to that learning. So basically what they were saying is that in the coming times, we're seeing more of a shift away from that traditional, here's the knowledge, you can take it, lecture 50 minutes, same time every day, to more of a variable learning paradigm that kind of looks to see where the students are and has different methods of meeting those needs of the students. And that's kind of where I break down. And now Greg is going to talk a little bit about his section of the article, and then we'll come down back and break down the two different charts that they have.
Hey, from the cold and snowy Midwest, guys. There's just a few key points that we wanted to break down from my portion of the article, and these points are that you cannot increase outputs without increasing costs. Any attempt to do so is a threat to the quality, and the faculty would then face the brunt of the consequences for lack of quality. The second point that we wanted to make is that the learning paradigm is where each consecutive class learns more than the other, and over time the institution as a whole benefits. So by measuring the learning outcomes and using this learning paradigm, each class would gain more and more knowledge as they go, and then obviously the institution will have stronger academics within the institution after that. Next, under the old school of thought, what the students are learning in the classroom does not meet their needs or the needs of the professorate. Excess of lecture and insufficient time for practice. And this one I think is big. This one that we've seen in our own lives. There's a lot of times, especially in undergrad, because this article is focused on undergraduate learning, that you spend a lot of time discussing and lecturing and learning about theory, but not a lot of time, in practicum or in real world situations, learning hands-on and on-the-job stuff. And I think that is very important as we, try to put ourselves out there in the workforce to get that experience. And so a shift away from this instruction paradigm, which puts such a heavy focus on the lecture and, just on how good the professor is at being a lecturer and more towards increasing learning outcomes, I think is definitely a positive step in the right direction. And then finally, a gap exists between what we say we should achieve with higher education and what the reality is of the system that we have in place. So there's a gap between what we want our college graduates to know and what we actually do know. And the example that he uses in the article is that many math majors and physics majors, they know how to do the equations when they're in the environment in which they learned them, but once they get out of that environment and they don't have the same cues as they did before, then they can't even solve basic equations, and that's solely because they're seeing them in a slightly different form than that of which they were taught. So that even goes even more into they're not actually learning how to do it. They're just being instructed about ways to solve problems without actually grasping that and gaining that knowledge. So those are some of the key points that I wanted to summarize in my portion.
In the first chart, Barr&Tagg, they break down these three different areas of kind of difference between the instruction paradigm and the learning paradigm. And those three areas are mission and purposes, criteria for success, and teaching and learning structures. Basically, on the mission and purposes side, on the instruction paradigm, you basically, like I said earlier, have a transmission of knowledge from point A to point B. Whereas on the learning paradigm side of that, you kind of want to spur that knowledge discovery in the students, not necessarily telling them, hey, this is a cloud, this is what a cloud looks like, but hey, what's that in the sky? Think about these different things and how would you describe them, or something like that. It's kind of more of a deeper thinking about the subject matter that they're taking into hand, rather than here's the subject matter, learn it. In the instruction paradigm, you basically have courses and programs, whereas the learning paradigm is more focused on learning structures, learning environments, rather than strictly here's a course, go to the course. Whereas you might have in the learning paradigm, for example, living learning communities being a way to kind of focus that learning and spur that knowledge in students. Also, you have kind of in the instruction paradigm, more of you focus on the quality of instruction and achieving, just access for diverse students. Whereas the learning program, you want success for diverse groups of students, and not only focused on just the quality of instruction, but you want to improve the total quality of all learning inside of the classroom, outside of the classroom, and not just focus strictly on the instruction part of learning. With criteria for success on the instruction paradigm, it really deals more with objective details, things that you can measure, such as quality of resources, enrollment, revenue growth, quality of faculty instruction, inputs, resources, quality of the students coming into your program, say, 4.0s, ACT test scores, SAT test scores, that type of thing. Whereas the learning paradigm is really looking more at the subjective rather than the objective. How your students faring when they leave the college rather than how they are when they enter. You necessarily don't want to know. You want to see how far you've taken them, not necessarily where they start from. More about learning technology development, expansion, bringing in new technologies, experimenting with things in the classroom. Kind of the learning growth of your students, the kind of efficiency of your program in kind of transmitting that knowledge or producing that knowledge base. and more about the quality of the learning, not necessarily the quality of the instruction. So that's a way that the two paradigms differ. And then in the teaching learning structures, the instruction paradigm really is going to be more of a strict, format. It stays the same, doesn't really alter. 50-minute lectures, 3-hour credit hour courses, one teacher, one classroom, different disciplines and departments, everything spread out. English department, engineering, everybody has their kind of role and their space. Whereas the learning structure is more variable and the environment kind of changes to the student. So this could be some things such as, employing distance learning or discussion-based learning, problem-based learning, all of these other different kinds of pedagogical techniques, active learning in the classroom, rather than what others would phrase as passive learning. So those are some of the ways that the learning structures and the teaching structures would differ between the instruction paradigm and the learning paradigm. Now, Greg is going to break down the second chart.
So as we know, Brandon broke down the first chart that Barr&Tagg put in their article, and so I'm going to break down the next one. I'm just going to give you guys some highlights of it. So it covers both paradigms, the differences in learning theory, productivity and funding, and the nature of the roles. In the instruction paradigm, knowledge exists out there, and out there. And in the learning paradigm, knowledge exists in each person's mind and is shaped by individual experience. In the instruction paradigm, learning is not active. Live teacher is required and live students are required. And in the learning paradigm, an active learner is required, but not a live teacher. And then talent and ability are rare in the instruction paradigm, and they're abundant in the learning paradigm, according to Barr&Tagg. And then productivity and funding. The definition of productivity in the instruction paradigm is cost per hour of instruction per student. So that's like the credit hour system that we have now. And then funding for hours of instruction. And in the learning paradigm, the definition of productivity is the cost per unit of learning per student, and then the funding is for learning outcomes. Obviously, in the learning paradigm, we have to measure different outcomes and use learning outcomes to get the funding. And then the nature of the roles is also different. So, faculty are primarily lecturers in the instruction paradigm, and then in the learning paradigm, they become designers. Designers of courses, of different ways to learn and ways to reach those learning outcomes. And then faculty and students act independently and in isolation in the instruction paradigm. And then they work in teams and they work with each other and other staff in the learning paradigm. Staff serve and support faculty and the process of instruction in the instruction paradigm. And then teachers develop every student's competencies and talents in the learning paradigm. Any expert can teach in the instruction paradigm, and in the learning paradigm, all staff are educators who produce student learning and success. And then there's line governance and independent actors in the instruction paradigm, and shared governance and teamwork in the learning paradigm. And one of the things that they say about the learning paradigm in this article is that students take a much more responsible role in their learning in the learning paradigm than they do in the instruction paradigm. And in the instruction paradigm, he kind of compares them to passive passive vessels that just gain the knowledge, but they're not actively learning, the knowledge like they do in the learning paradigm. And I just wanted to close by saying, that at the end of the article, the authors compare the shift in paradigms to the movement of a ship. And what they say is that a ship can be moved by a trim tab, which is like a very small instrument that can be used to move the whole ship. And they believe that this paradigm shift, it's very small steps that can be taken, but that it can have a very big impact on higher education. And so now that we've covered, the bulk of the article through the video, we're now going to cover some discussion questions as well. So hold tight for that, because I'll be doing that live.